Okay, let's bring them in, please.
Deputy and Rice, go line them up, bring them in. Jen will.
Would you like a cough drop?
I'm good, John.
What are those?
Reese's egg.
You want a Reese's egg? I start doing that at night. If I start in the day, I'm in big trouble. But thank you.
It's the only thing I see now.
Dr. Meir, before the lunch recess, just to kind of reset, remind where we're at, we were talking about John's brain illness and how that affected his ability to understand the nature and consequences of his actions and the wrongfulness of his actions on the night that Phoebe died. And specifically, we were talking about how it is, the impact that the fact that John is the one who released Phoebe over the side of the bridge to her death. Why is that important in your evaluation and John's ability to have created memories and to relate memories after the fact?
As I was saying, if you turn the clock back to the day before this tragedy, I think there's a great deal of evidence that this father loved this child. And I don't think that regardless of what we might believe about what occurred here, that evidence would be contradicted. So that is a part of my understanding of the case, is that he did love this child. And given that, he is emotionally engaged, deeply emotionally engaged in what's happening here in court, in what he did, in his understanding of it. And that level of emotional intensity and engagement and the grief that he experienced as a father makes it more difficult for him to recover, think clearly, put the psychotic symptoms aside and be in touch with common sense reality.
And does that then make it more difficult for him to relay the events after the fact?
Yes. And it means that he's conflicted. He has opposite feelings about what it is, what happened. Like any parent who has concern and interest and behaves in a way which is in the best interest of their child, he feels a sense of responsibility because a terrible thing happened, regardless of how he might understand it, regardless of how the court or the jury might understand it. As a parent, he feels a sense of responsibility and feels tormented by that.
Did John believe that he was hearing other people's thoughts?
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
This is an aspect of the thought disorder and the hallucination sort of combining together. It's an idea of reference. It's a quite well known and described phenomenon in the medical and psychiatric literature going back many decades. Sometimes it's referred to thought insertion, the feeling a person has that someone else or some other force is pushing a thought into their brain and making them think about it. These are usually unwanted thoughts. They're usually negative thoughts. They're sometimes grotesque, violent, or sexual thoughts that the person doesn't want to have, but they're in the person's head. I think that was one of the symptoms that is well described in his history.
Okay. And what sort of thoughts was he having at the time that this event occurred?
Particularly thoughts that some of the people in his life were not real. They weren't the real person that they would have seemed to be, that they were influenced or overcome by demons or the devil, that they were imposters. There's, again, a long-standing understanding of this, historically known as the Capgras syndrome, named after the doctor who first described it many years ago, where a person believes that people around them are imposters or they're being affected or influenced by imposter forces. So there is evidence that he had these feelings regarding his mother and his relationship with her and so on.
And when a person is having these type of thoughts that are intruding upon them, does a person feel that they must act on them?
That almost always there's some feeling that some action needs to be taken in response to these thoughts, these stimulus, these hallucinations. When the psychosis is at a low-level baseline, one of the things that characterizes good treatment and a good outcome is that some people with severe psychotic disorders can begin to put aside the feeling that they have to respond and act on the voices. This is not a state of mind that John has achieved during the history of his treatment that I am familiar with. So most people who have this psychotic experience have this feeling, this urge, this sense that they must do something about it. Not necessarily follow what the voices tell them, sometimes react against the voices, sometimes take protective action, but they have to do something about it. So that's a very strong part of the psychotic experience.
During the days leading up to Phoebe's death, was John having thoughts and feelings about the custody of Phoebe?
Yes.
And how did that play into his understanding of the wrongfulness of his actions or not understanding the nature and consequences?
Even in his psychotic state, he maintained some abilities, and this is normal and expected. He could drive a car, probably not safely, He could walk, he could talk. Psychosis doesn't immediately affect those functions. In some respects, he could think and remember things. He had a long-standing concern about who was taking care of Phoebe and whether she was safe in her mother's home, whether she was safe around boyfriends or other people who might be in the mother's home. And there was this custody dispute about this, where he got a lawyer and he took actions which were connected with reality, with common sense reality. Those things become confused and distorted in the psychotic condition. So that the content of his thought is focused on protecting Phoebe, on taking care of her, on making sure nothing bad happens to her, and that it is exaggerated and distorted into this massively disconnected sense of reality is tragically not unexpected. So he has this irrational state of mind that he must do anything necessary to protect her.
As part of the records that you reviewed in this case, were you provided with the emails that Mr. Jonchuck exchanged with Ms. Torres, the family law attorney?
Yes.
Is there anything inconsistent with John in the week leading up to Phoebe's death being able to schedule an appointment to meet with his lawyer?
No, nothing that would be where he couldn't schedule an appointment.
Did you see anything in the content of those emails, that the emails with Ms. Torres, that corroborated or supported your opinion as to John's psychosis leading up to the time of the offense?
Yes, in combination with what he told me and what he's told other people about those interactions. And that is that what I got from him, and when I compared it to those emails, the emails pointed in the direction of him being in a peculiar state of mind, arriving in his pajama bottoms, not being nearly as clear, rational, focused in a reasonable way on talking to his lawyer about a family law problem as he presented it to me when I asked him about it. So what struck me is that the emails suggested that he was, even in that limited context, impaired in a way that he wasn't aware of and wasn't subsequently reporting.
We talked earlier this morning that one of the things that part of your opinion in this case is that John believed he was under this threat, that there was a threat out there to himself and to Phoebe. How does going to see the lawyer and on the 6th and then showing up again on the 7th, how does that interact with this illogical or irrational threat that he was perceiving?
The threat isn't entirely irrational, out of touch with reality, illogical. Some of the threat is based on some thread of reality. He has concerns, some of them apparently realistically based, that Phoebe might not be in the best situation with her mother. So he's pursuing that. The problem is he has no ability to separate the realistic concerns from the irrational psychotic concerns.
The religious ideas and statements that John was making, such as claiming to be the Pope or calling other people the Pope or God or Michael, what does that all have to do with John's ability to understand the nature and consequences or the wrongfulness of his actions?
In this context, these are not firmly held religious beliefs. These are psychotic beliefs. They are belief that he is God, he has a special, unique connection to God, other people are God. So this is a manifestation of his psychosis, his disconnection with reality, his delusion. He is also focused in a way that has some connection, again, to common sense reality. He thinks the answers are in the Bible, but the answers are in this knocking, special Swedish Bible that he has this irrational connection to. He goes to a priest, he goes to a religious authority to try to get answers. That doesn't work out because it's not a realistic thing for him to do, and it's not done in a realistic way. It's a psychotic manifestation.
Is it your opinion that to John, the information about this Swedish Bible, what was coming from it, was it something that John was experiencing intensely?
Yes.
Was he preoccupied with it?
Yes. And by that I mean that there were times that he was not able to get his mind off it.
Was he preoccupied with what the religious leader, or the priest or priests that he went to see, their responses to him?
Yes, in the sense that it meant things to him at an intensity level that are grotesquely exaggerated.
In keeping with the religious and the demon theme, you saw in the records that John had put salt around the doors and the windows
Yes.
to keep demons out.
Yes.
What does that mean to you in terms of his state of mind and his ability to understand wrongfulness and nature and consequences?
So this is a action that in a clinical setting or in a legal setting, we would typically think of as magical thinking. Thinking that you can do something and then by some magical unknown force, it will have some effect on the environment. So he probably wouldn't have described it as magic. He would have just described it as powerful and important and protective. But the thought that somehow salt is going to magically protect him from these forces and threats and demons that he can't even really define is a manifestation of magical thinking. It's a part of the thought disorder. It's a part of the psychosis.
From your review of everything, records, depositions, did you see where John had been talking to family members, his stepmom, about going to hell, and voices talking to him about going to hell?
Yes.
And what do you make of that?
Again, these are in isolation, one sentence at a time. These are things that a normal person might have concerns about. But in the context of this situation, considering his circumstances and the intensity of all of these things, these are psychotic, religious-focused beliefs. And they are genuinely related to an overwhelming fear that the only thing that's important is that people are going to go to hell. He's going to go to hell. Phoebe is going to go to hell. The world is going to end. An overwhelming dread, which is at once unspecified. It's terrible and horrible and can't be resisted. And also there's some specific focus on it, people going to hell.
And when we spoke earlier about how the psychosis an aspect of it is the thought disorder, where I think you used the example, you think you're testifying here in court, but you might be standing in a parking lot somewhere else, right?
Yes,
okay.
2 places at the same time.
So John is being preoccupied with this fear of hell and demons, at the same time does he report thinking Phoebe was an angel?
Yes. And that he could protect her and assure that she would be safe and okay. And I do not mean to suggest that this was some logical idea or plan of his. It was a passing, confused thought, a desperate thought of a desperate psychotic parent who wanted to protect his child. He wasn't able to think, oh, she's an angel. If she goes to heaven, she'll be okay. That level of logic wasn't available to him. But the notion that she is an angel, as normal parents think of their children, and everything will be okay because she is an angel, that's the tiny little piece that's grounded in common sense reality. And the distortion is that somehow dropping her off the bridge will bring this good thing about.
Did John remember very much of his drive to the Dick Meisner Bridge that night?
As he described it to me, he seemed to think that he did, but as I checked that with other information, it's my conclusion that what he thinks he remembers about what happened isn't particularly consistent with what other reliable sources suggest. So I think that this is probably an example of where he really thinks he does remember and is trying to report it accurately, but doesn't have a good ability to do that.
Okay. As an example of that, did you see in the reports where Officer Vickers says he did not put on his lights and sirens behind John until after John had pulled over on the top of the bridge?
Yes.
Okay. And is John's memory of, well, I maybe should not use the word memory, is John's belief, his statement about what he believes happened, is it consistent with that?
No, it's not. His report is that the lights were on before, that Phoebe said something to him about the lights, meaning the lights and sirens. And I think he genuinely feels and believes that those were there before he pulled over.
Did you note in the reports and information that you reviewed that Phoebe was wearing her seatbelt?
I did.
And in the car seat?
Yes.
What do you make of that?
When a person's in a psychotic state and they're confused and they're desperate and they're sleep deprived, they still do the habitual things they do. They still light a cigarette the same way they light a cigarette. They still speak pretty much the same way they speak. That is, their enunciation and their accent is the same. If they're accustomed to putting their child in the back seat of the car in a child seat and buckling them in, even if they're psychotic, they're going to continue to do that.
Same with John having his seatbelt on when he is eventually pulled over by the police.
I would say so, yes.
Does John having put his seatbelt on mean that he understood what he did that night?
No.
Sort of in that same thought disorder category, where believing one thing but a completely opposite thing at the same time. Did John believe he could get away from the danger somehow that night?
I wouldn't say that I know the answer to that question. I have a response to that and some opinion about that. He was desperate to get away from the danger. He was compelled to get away from the danger, to get Phoebe away from the danger, and he felt more than thought that getting in his car and running away would somehow accomplish that. I'd
like to talk about when John was on top of the bridge and Officer Vickers is out with his firearm trained on John. And John still does the act of releasing Phoebe. What does that mean to you, in your opinion, in terms of John appreciating the nature and consequences and the wrongfulness of his actions?
He was out of touch with reality. Start with the basics. I think that it's likely that he recognized that person as a police officer. I think that it's likely that he either saw or was aware that the police officer might have a gun. He was desperate to protect his daughter, and nothing else mattered. And some crazy, irrational, distorted idea in his head compelled him to drop her over that bridge to protect her. It didn't matter if there was a police officer there or not.
Is there, in terms of reality, is there a distinction between dropping Phoebe off the bridge and throwing her off the bridge in terms of the effect?
We mean her dying?
Yes.
No.
When you spoke to John, and in your review of the records, have you seen where he has drawn a distinction in that regard?
Yes. Yes.
And what does that mean to you?
One of the things that I talked to him directly about was this moment, and asked him to do his best to tell me what was in his mind. And at one point he made reference to throwing her, and in another part of that conversation he referred to dropping her, and later on he made reference to throwing her so that she could fly like an angel. Now, I want to add that I don't think that was in his head at the time he was on that bridge. I don't think he was able to think that clearly. I think the only thing that was in his head was that somehow he had to do this and then she would be safe. After the fact, years later, when he tried to understand himself, I think he's trying to figure out why he would do such a horrific thing.
As it relates to John releasing Phoebe to protect her, to make her safe, and you've just said, that's just not in touch with reality, right?
Yes.
Okay. Is part of the difficulty in a situation like this is that you're having to try to explain something that doesn't really make sense in a way that makes sense as you're relating it to us, to the jury? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. We, other people, in order to communicate, need to put things in rational sentences. Maybe not grammatically correct all the time, but rational sentences. We need to put things in rational ideas. We need to speak in a chronologically sensible manner. So when we talk about and try to understand the state of mind of someone who isn't able to do that, we immediately begin to talk about it as if it makes more sense than it really does. So there are some things I have come to believe, particularly in my experience in clinical practice, that we just can't put in words in a way that is clear. And these intense psychotic experiences fall into that category.
John left, got back in his car, and drove away from the top of the bridge, right? And
Yes.
eventually was stopped by police. What do you make of, as it relates to him understanding the nature and consequences of his actions, the wrongfulness? What is your opinion about that aspect of it?
From a realistic point of view, there's no possibility whatsoever that he's going to evade police capture at that point. So why does he get in his car and drive away? He gets in his car and drives away because he's not dealing with reality. He's not connected to common sense reality. He's continuing to function based on this irrational urge that there's a terrible danger and he just has to get away. He has to go. He has to escape. It's not thought out, it's not considered, it's not logical, it's not rational. It's compelled, automatic, and irrational.
And in the back to that place of the disorganized thinking where you're thinking you're in two places at once, we talked a little bit ago, right before the break, about how John believed that both he and Phoebe needed to die.
Yes.
Right? But John doesn't die. Is that an example of that disorganized two places at once?
Yes, it is. And it's also related to some belief that if he dies and isn't in control, then he won't be there to protect Phoebe.
Does the fact that John didn't follow Phoebe over the bridge mean that he understood the nature and consequences of his actions?
No, it does not.
Does it mean that he didn't understand the wrongfulness of his actions?
It does not mean that.
When John was arrested and taken to the sheriff's office in Manatee County, have you reviewed that transcript?
I have, yes.
Seen. Do you have an opinion about John's reaction and his interaction with the police officers there at the sheriff's office that supports your opinion about him being insane?
Yes, his statements and demeanor are consistent with a psychotic individual, very consistent, very clearly consistent. And if he was psychotic on the bridge, he certainly would have been psychotic a few minutes or hours later, and indeed, I believe, was psychotic for many days later.
Does it make rational sense to ask a police officer as you're sitting handcuffed to a chair if you can just be let go?
No.
How about if you can be taken to the airport?
Does not make rational sense.
Or the city of Babylon, for that matter?
Again, preoccupation with religious ideas related to delusions, manifestation. It is my opinion that's a manifestation of his psychosis at the time.
Okay. May I have one moment, Your Honor? In conclusion, Dr. Mayer, do you believe at the time that John released Phoebe over the bridge that he was suffering from a severe mental disease or defect?
Yes.
And is it your opinion that John did not understand the nature or wrongfulness of his actions?
I don't believe he understood the nature of it or the wrongfulness of it.
And in fact, did John, did he even have a grasp on the difference between life and death at that point?
Not in any realistic sense.
That's what I have.
Cross?
Good afternoon, Dr. Moore.
Afternoon.
You interviewed the defendant one time
Twice.
prior to forming your opinion,
Once.
and that was for about 3 hours.
Yes,
No one was there, just the two of you.
that's correct.
No video,
No,
no audio,
no,
no state attorneys.
no.
Because we're not allowed to know you were doing that, right?
I'm not sure what the rules are.
Well, you're-
But there was no
you're-
state attorney there.
You're a forensic psychiatrist. You're supposed to know the law about this, right?
I don't know what rules might apply to other people's presence. I'm sorry.
Defense attorneys weren't there.
No,
You didn't interview any collateral witnesses.
that's correct.
You were afraid that if you interview them, they might have some biases and motives.
I wouldn't say I was afraid. It was my belief, it is my belief that the best and most reliable information was the information I obtained and relied on, and it was more than sufficient to reach the conclusions.
So you had no questions that you wanted answered from about the defendant's past or his relationships. Everything was in those reports and depositions.
I would never say I have no questions about a case, about a human being. I was able to more than fully satisfy my concerns about diagnosis and conclusions based on the information that I reviewed.
But it's not uncommon for a psychologist to conduct collateral interviews,
It is not uncommon.
even in a forensic evaluation such as this.
That's correct.
And there are different ways to do evaluations and investigations and forensically.
Yes?
Because someone does it differently, does that mean it's not done correctly?
No, not necessarily.
Okay. You didn't do any testing, pen and paper, I believe was the expression used.
That's correct.
Okay. Go back to what happened on the bridge. On the bridge, you indicated in your report that defendant.
Objection, improper impeachment. Name and approach.
No, overrule.
You indicated in your report that the defendant had a feeling that she would fly away because she was an angel.
Yes.
But you call and say in your deposition that when questioned about that, he said, "I don't know."
That's correct.
Okay. So you wrote in your report that he had that feeling, but when you questioned him, he didn't know, but you put that in your report that he had the feeling.
That's correct. And
Isn't that inconsistent on your part?
they're certainly inconsistent in the information I received to him, because on the one hand, he indicates he doesn't know. On the other hand, he has the feeling that she is an angel and she will fly away. That is exactly the kind of inconsistency and thought disorder that I have referred to in the context of his psychosis.
But you don't put that in your report.
Well, I referred to it, I think, in detail in my report. I didn't detail all of the inconsistencies in my report that I have in my testimony today. That certainly is true.
Your report was 9 pages long, right?
Yes.
You indicated in your report,
Objection to hearsay, because it's an out-of-court statement. He's either using it for impeachment, in which case he would need to lay the proper foundation. If he's just asking him about a prior out-of-court statement, that's hearsay.
Overrule.
in your report, Doctor, did you indicate that the defendant was unsure why he acted the way he did on the bridge?
Yes.
But you recall in your deposition indicating that he told you that he did what he did on the bridge to keep her safe.
Yes.
When you agree that's inconsistent.
What is inconsistent there is that it can't be both ways. And he felt and believed that it was both ways.
But your reporting of it is inconsistent in both ways.
That's your conclusion. I don't agree with that.
And if we had it recorded, we would know exactly what was said, right?
If we had what recorded?
Your interview of the defendant.
If we had a recording of my interview with the defendant, we could play that, yes.
Okay. Now, you indicated earlier in your statement today that he had hallucinations on the bridge.
Yes.
Okay. And that's consistent with your report. He remembers hearing voices.
Yes.
That's the hallucination, the voices?
Those would be the primary hallucinations, yes.
Okay. Any other hallucinations on the bridge?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay. Do you recall giving the deposition in this case?
I do.
Do you recall saying that when asked, was he having hallucinations, delusions at the time of the murder, he was having delusions? To the best of my ability to reconstruct it, I don't identify hallucinations. Do you recall saying that?
Yes.
So in your report, you say he's hearing voices and has hallucinations. Today you say that, but in your deposition, he didn't have any hallucinations at the time of the murder.
You know what? I think that I need to look at my deposition to make sure I understand the context of your question. Because I don't think that these contradictions are as you are presenting them in your questions.
Do you have a copy of your deposition?
I do.
You can go to page 26, line 8.
Yes, well, as I suspected, the questions are a little different. What you asked me here today is, was he having hallucinations on the bridge? What I was asked in the deposition was he having hallucinations at the time of the murder?
And they are on the bridge.
Mr. Ellis, let him finish.
And they are not exactly the same. There is a distinction between those, and there was a distinction in my mind between those. At the time of the murder is a non-specific reference to anything that might be considered at the time of the murder. On the bridge is from the time the car enters the bridge while it's on the bridge. I certainly was not making any attempt to avoid your questions in the deposition. I don't think there's a contradiction there. I think that my statements in my report and the deposition and in my testimony are consistent.
At the time of the murder, that occurs on the bridge, correct?
Yes?
Okay. So I'm not sure how you could confuse at the time of the murder with being on the bridge.
Overruled.
I think at the time of the murder might also be construed as from the time he puts the child in the car. When did the murder exactly start and stop? Was it when he took her out of the seat? Was it when he put her in the seat? Was it when he dropped her over the bridge? I don't know the answer to that question. I answered the question in the deposition to the best of my ability with a broad understanding of what the question meant.
Doctor, you're forensically trained, you know the legal definitions, and you're trying to indicate that the time of the murder, when he was talking about the bridge, and that was in that deposition, we were talking about the bridge at that moment. You're trying to say that you didn't understand when the time of the murder was?
I certainly understood that the murder occurred at a particular date and time and place. When that inclination began, when the event related to the murder began, I don't think that, frankly, any of us know exactly when that was, and I don't claim to know exactly when that was.
see on page 27. And again, we're talking about the hallucinations on the bridge. At the time of the murder, you indicated that you weren't sure.
Yes?
So if he was hearing voices on the way to the bridge and on the bridge, if your definition is the murder could have started before then he was hearing voices on the, and had hallucinations at the time of the murder, right?
Maybe so.
But that's not what you said in your deposition, is it?
I'm sorry, I don't want to be too detailed, but exactly what is it you're saying I didn't say in my deposition?
You in your court indicated he was hearing voices, and in your deposition you said he wasn't having hallucinations. I'm trying to figure out how that can make that contradiction on your part applies.
I don't know that I can provide additional testimony directly to that question. If you would like me to try to consider that beyond the narrow question, I'll certainly try to respond.
We'll move on, doctor. You indicated that he was not bipolar, correct?
I don't believe that's the proper final diagnosis, that's right.
Okay. And you didn't find that he did not have an antisocial personality disorder?
That's correct.
Why did you find that?
Because these other brain illnesses and mental illnesses are far and away more significant in understanding his personality defects, and the proper use of the personality disorder diagnosis does not apply here.
Okay. But did you look into his background to rule that out as well?
I looked into his background sufficiently to see that he had problems with authority figures, that he had some conflicts at school, conflicts with his parents.
Okay.
So the answer to your question is yes. I looked into his background sufficiently to know that he had some features of antisocial behavior.
You agreed that prior to his incarceration that his condition was significantly worsened by chronic polysubstance drug abuse.
Yes.
What is chronic polysubstance drug abuse?
It means ongoing, more than one substance use of drugs or alcohol that are bad for a person.
And what was those drugs?
I think primarily alcohol and marijuana.
Did he report to you any other drugs he was using at this time?
What he reported to me was that he used alcohol and marijuana. He took some pills that weren't prescribed to him at times. He didn't always know what they were. And he acknowledged that he had used some other drugs. I don't recall him mentioning specific other drugs.
Okay. So he didn't mention to you methamphetamines or crystal meth?
I don't recall. He might have.
Cocaine?
Again, I'm not entirely sure, but it was not a drug that he was using at or around the time that I was evaluating.
Or spice?
Actually, now that you mention it, I recall he did mention spice.
Okay. And when was he indicating he had used that?
Intermittently in his life, but not for at least weeks before this event.
And you're indicating he was under a psychotic episode. I believe that's the word, correct? Psychotic episode?
Yes.
At the time that he murdered his daughter? As in dropping her off the bridge?
Yes.
Okay. And were you able to determine when that episode began?
At least several days before the event. I believe he, as I have testified, was suffering from a chronic psychotic condition, so there was this baseline level, and I think it got much worse in the 2 or 3 days before this incident.
And that psychotic episode, when it got worse, dealt with, he had a fear of some malingering evil force coming after him and his daughter?
I'm sorry, did you say malingering evil force?
Malevolent, I meant malevolent. If I said malingering, I have a mistake. Malevolent.
Some malevolent evil force, yes.
All right, that was the psychosis.
That was a part of the psychosis, yes.
But earlier the day, that day of the murder, he was not afraid for Phoebe and himself. But that developed sometime during that day, right?
He was concerned about Phoebe's well-being all the time, on an ongoing basis. His intense fear of terrible things happening, I believe, was relatively short-term, hours before the incident.
Okay. And he indicated to you he went to the lawyer to get clarity about issues that were related to the Bible and custody.
Yes.
And you didn't really interrogate him too much about those details.
That's correct.
And you went to the church that he visited for spiritual help about the Bible.
Yes, he told me that.
And when you went there, he felt disappointed that he didn't get that understanding.
Yes.
Didn't relate to you that he went to any other church or saw any other clergy.
That's correct, he did not.
He never talked about the Ice Age coming.
I do not recall any reference in my discussion with him about the Ice Age coming.
When he approached the bridge, he knew he was on the Dick Meisner Bridge, an approach bridge. He knew he wasn't on the Skyway, correct?
I'm not sure.
Would you, if you look page 51 of your deposition? Page line 9 through 11.
Yes, he told me he was on the first bridge.
He may have not called it Dick Meisner, but he knew it as an approach bridge.
He certainly didn't call it the Dick Meisner Bridge. I recall that clearly. What I said in my deposition and what I recall as I'm reading it is he referred to it as the first bridge.
So he had an awareness of where he was.
To that extent, yes.
When the defendant got out of his car, he saw the officer with the gun?
I'm not sure if he saw the gun or not. He certainly was aware there was an officer there. I'm not sure if he saw the gun, if he knew the gun was pointed at him. I don't recall that I have reliable information regarding that question.
Well, in your report, do you recall writing he remembers a gun and a policeman with a gun?
I do.
But you're not sure whether he saw he had a gun or not?
Whether he saw the gun pointed at him or not is what I was referring to.
So he saw the gun, but he didn't have it drawn? Is that what your distinction is?
I don't know. What he told me is he knew, I think he used the word cop, he knew there was a cop and he knew he had a gun.
Again, we don't have a recording of what he said to help us do it.
We do not.
He has no memory of speaking to the officer, correct?
Uh,
On the bridge.
on the bridge.
Officer Vickers on the bridge.
I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. He told me that he didn't. He has also said that he might have said something to him. I think his memory about that is confused.
Well, you wrote in your report he has no memory of talking to the police officer, but is reasonably certain that he did.
That's correct.
You can be manic and not psychotic, right?
Yes.
You believe that the defendant was manipulative?
Objection,
I want to be very specific and direct in my answer to you. All human beings can be manipulative. So my saying yes doesn't give us much information. Can you be more specific about what you mean in terms of him and him being manipulative?
Well, you were asked in the deposition, was he manipulative, and you indicated yes.
I would stand by that answer.
Right, and you didn't give that caveat that all humans are manipulative, as you're doing here in court, right?
I didn't.
Page 63 of the deposition, page 21, line 21 and 22.
I'm sorry, 50, what was it again?
63,
I'm sorry.
21 and 22.
I would stand by what I said in my deposition, and I would be happy to explain that more if you'd like to hear the explanation.
I think you tried to already explain it. Thank you. Delusions, they're powerful, compelling, and fixed. I believe those were the words you used.
Are you speaking about delusions in general or his delusions? I'm not sure I understand the question. Delusions are not always fixed. They certainly can change. They're usually, but not always, powerful.
In this particular case for the defendant, they were powerful
Yes.
and fixed.
Fixed is a relative term. In the context of psychiatry, a fixed delusion is a delusion generally which is very consistent, almost logical in its internal belief. That is, it has an internal logic to it. It doesn't change from month to month or even year to year. Fixed delusions are typically related to conspiracy theories in people who suffer from psychosis. His delusions were, I would describe them as consistent, not fixed.
He had an overwhelming fear that of malevolent force that they had to flee from, correct?
Yes.
He indicated he threw his daughter, thought she was going up to heaven, correct?
Yes.
He doesn't tell Officer Vickers about this fear or why he did what he did, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
He goes to the sheriff's office. They do a several-hour video of him. Nowhere during that video does he make any indication of of this fear or that he has to flee from, this compelling force.
Not in any words that I have described or I heard or was aware that he described, no.
Proselytizing, I think I'm saying that wrong. You get up on a soapbox and you tell something, is that, you aware of that word and that familiarity?
Yes.
He didn't do any of that in this case. To the officers, do arresting, transporting to the jail. In that entire time, he didn't say any of that, did he?
I would not say that I think he was proselytizing.
And he indicated he did not throw Phoebe in the water, right?
He dropped her, or he certainly didn't indicate that he intended to throw her into the water. That is correct.
Now, the voices that you were hearing, they were telling him he needed to die.
Among other things, yes.
So it was that he needed to die. There's nothing in your report that would indicate that Phoebe needed to die.
Well, I would agree with you. That's what's in my report.
Okay. Are you aware that he told other experts that he and Phoebe had to die?
Yes.
Okay.
He also said that in other contexts.
But not to you.
That's correct.
Were you the first mental health expert to conduct a forensic evaluation of him regarding sanity? Or do you know?
I don't know.
When did you interview him?
July 2017.
July 3rd?
Yes.
Did you consider suicide by cop in any of this activity by the defendant on the bridge?
Yes. Yes.
I'm sorry. And what did you come to the conclusion regarding that?
I came to the conclusion that this was not a case that characterization fit.
And why is that?
The characterization of suicide by cop is professionally best understood as an individual confronting a police officer relentlessly with threatening actions toward the police officer until the police officer finally has to take lethal action against them. That is, waving a gun at a cop, waving a knife at a cop, physically charging a police officer, and none of that occurred here.
You're aware of Dr. Arthur's reports?
Yes?
Defendant admitted to, or said he had one somatic hallucination?
I'm not sure that I remember the details of that, but I do recall in Dr. Arthur's records there was reference to hallucinations and somatic symptoms.
One reference regarding the bubbling of the skin, do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And can the drugs that we talked about, spice, those kind of meth, can they cause you to have such a somatic hallucination?
What I would say is they could certainly cause you to have a sensation that might be interpreted in a psychotic individual as a hallucination, yes.
A moment, Judge.
Sure.
Nothing further, Judge.
Redraw.
Just want to clarify a couple of points. How long did you meet with John?
3 hours.
If you needed more time to meet with him, would you have told us that?
Yes,
Have you submitted us bills for more than 3 hours?
yes.
Do you spend as long as you need to with a defendant in order to obtain the information that you need in order to form your opinion?
Yes,
Did you cut it short with Mr. Jonchuck?
absolutely not. Nor did I do additional work that wasn't necessary.
Would interviewing people 2.5 years after the fact be that type of work?
Yes,
And, okay, I think we talked about that enough on direct. I'm not going to belabor the point about the hallucinations, but if I could just have you refer to page 61 of your deposition. I think before you were looking at 26 and 27 about it.
yes,
Did you testify about Mr. Jonchuck saying that he was hearing voices during the drive?
yes. If I may
Yes.
add to a previous question,
Yes.
as I'm looking at this.
Unresponsive.
How's the approach?
Sure, Doctor. What previous question are you talking about?
I was asked some questions about whether his hallucinations said he needed to die or Phoebe needed to die, and as I'm looking at this, I see that there's information that would clarify that question.
Okay.
I was asked, and the voices said that he needed to die, but if he did, his daughter would go to hell, question mark. I answered yes, indicating that the voices threatened or indicated that he and Phoebe needed to die,
Okay.
but that if he died, Phoebe would go to hell.
Okay. And is that different in that disorganized thinking? Is that two different things, thinking she'll go to hell, that she'll be an angel? Is that part of what we're talking about?
Yes.
You were asked on cross about specifically spice,
Yes.
and is that something that you did speak with Mr. Jonchuck about?
Yes.
Right? And was the use of spice relevant to the time frame of when Phoebe died?
No.
Right? And is that why you ruled out drug use as being responsible or a part of this event?
That's a part of why I ruled it out, yes.
Okay. And does that go back to the records we talked about from St. Joseph's at the end of December 2014, when we talked about when he appeared at the ER?
Leading questions.
Did your review of the records from St. Joseph's have impact on your opinion as to whether drug use was involved at the time of the offense?
They certainly did. They were a reliable, objective medical record not a report from family members or other people years after the fact. It's difficult to prove that a person has never used drugs or never had drugs in their system at a particular time, but having a medical evaluation at a legitimate facility in the context of a presentation of a disturbed patient and a lack of any indication of drug use is a good, reliable medical record that establishes drug use is not present.
You were asked on cross about John's fear of this malevolent evil force coming after him. Is that the only symptom, manifestation of John's psychosis?
No, it's a prominent piece of what I've described as that fourth element of psychosis, which is the fear, the anxiety, the emotional part. And it can drive a lot of behavior and a lot of confused and bad behavior. If that was the only thing present, even an unhealthy person might be able to act in a reasonable way. But in this circumstance, at this episode, that was only a part of a much bigger picture that fed into.
You were asked on cross about John going to his lawyer to get clarity regarding the Bible and custody.
Yes.
Call it? Okay. Do people well, let me ask you this. As a psychiatrist, what would be your response to a person who came to you with a law book on contracts and asked you for help in getting clarity about that book?
Well, I would ask them why they thought I was the right person to ask for that question.
So does asking a lawyer for clarity on a Bible make sense?
No, and in the context of everything else in this case, I wouldn't say that somebody who goes to their lawyer and wants to know what they think of a Bible, that's not necessarily a sign of mental illness. There are a lot of people, their religious beliefs, they believe that asking a lawyer about something related to a holy book would be a reasonable thing to do. That goes along with their being a lawyer. In this case, in this circumstance, it is not that. In this case, in this circumstance, it is a merger of the reality and the psychosis, where he has a reasonable reason to go to his lawyer to talk to her about custody, and he has a psychotic reason to think she knows something about this special Bible.
Does telling your lawyer that you think that she is God, does that add to that analysis?
Yes, that kind of goes overboard with really not consistent even with strong religious beliefs.
You were asked the question on cross, and I believe it was in relation to the lawyer and the Bible and custody issue. You were asked, you didn't interrogate him about those details, did you? And I'm using the word interrogate.
No, let's try to find out what's going on with Mike.
I'm sorry?
That mic is making the sound that it usually makes sometimes, or it's distracting.
Okay.
I don't know. I think it's the courtroom mic, not
Yeah.
the press mic. So maybe. I don't think that's going to be any better. Can you?
Usually just have to bend it down a little.
Okay, let's try that. Sorry.
Can you still hear it? I don't hear anything.
No, I'll tell you if I hear something.
Okay, thank you. You were asked on cross, you didn't interrogate him about that. When you are evaluating a person, is it your practice, for an insanity evaluation, a competency evaluation, whatever it might be, is it your practice to interrogate a person?
No.
Why is that?
Interrogate implies to me, I think means, the proper dictionary definition, is to question somebody, interview them with a strong authority in a confrontive, demanding manner, as a police officer might properly question a witness or a defendant. There are times that some level of interrogation, if you will, might be appropriate in a psychiatric interview. Generally speaking, it is not. It tends to close people off rather than open them up.
And does closing a person off, does that mean they're less likely to give you information?
Yes.
Right. How does that affect the effectiveness?
It diminishes the
completeness?
quality of the psychiatric interview.
Quality, thank you. And that's not to say, and we talked earlier about how your process of speaking with a person you're evaluating, do you give them some instructions beforehand about how to answer the questions and try to use their memory?
Yes.
If a person tells you something generally, and then a detail is different or contradictory to what has been said at another time, or even what you may know to be true because it's corroborated by other details, might you question that person with a little bit greater specificity and question the issue a little bit more?
I might.
I was leaving, Judge.
In that situation, is that a situation where you might question the person a little bit more?
Yes.
Okay. In your review of the different experts' reports, depositions, all the things that you've reviewed, did you make note of the fact that, did John say different things to different people?
Yes.
Right. And for example, you were asked about, did John tell you about the Ice Age?
Yes.
Okay. Is this, we talked earlier about his psychotic state being a hindrance to him being able to create and relate memories.
Yes.
Is this part of that?
Yes, and in fact, if he didn't report different things to different people, I would be very suspicious that he was not being truthful and honest. Normal people, when they have different conversations about the same subject, report things a little differently. Mentally ill people, particularly, tend to report their experience, their memories, their history, their background differently. There are core things that remain similar, and then there are other things that are different from one day, one interview to the next. That's what I saw in this case, and that's what I would expect with an individual with his illness.
Can a person have an awareness of where he or she physically is at a moment and still be psychotic?
Yes.
You were asked something about whether John was manic and not psychotic, or manic and instead of psychotic, or something to that effect. I don't think you've testified.
Yes, Judge, that was not right.
I'll rephrase.
See if you can be a little bit more
I'll rephrase.
explicit.
Yes. Were you asked on cross-examination about John being manic?
I don't think so.
That was not the question.
Okay, I'll move on. you were asked on cross about proselytizing after John's arrest?
Yes.
Okay. Did you see evidence in the record that John spoke about religious ideas after he was apprehended?
Yes.
Did he speak about God,
Yes.
the fallen angel Michael,
Yes.
Babylon,
Yes.
the Swedish Bible,
Yes.
and the Pope?
Yes.
Finally, Doctor, going back to Dr. Arthur, was Dr. Arthur treating Mr. Jonchuck for a serious mental illness?
Yes.
Was he treating him with antipsychotic medications?
Yes.
These have been asked and answered, Your Honor.
Sustained.
I'm finished. Okay.
Further cross?
Yes, sir. Doctor, you indicated that brain illness and mental illness.
I've described a distinction between those two, yes.
Objection, Your Honor, under scope of redirect.
Or
You're not saying that he had organic brain damage, correct?
Well, this is a difficult subject, but you're going to have to tell me what exactly you mean when you use the term organic, because it doesn't have current, accepted, understood meaning in the medical profession today.
I'll try this way. You don't have a PET scan.
I have not relied on a PET scan in this case, that's
CAT
correct.
scan,
That's correct.
MRI.
That's correct.
You're not aware of any horrific damage to his head, falls from great distances, car accidents that caused him to bang his head on windshields, that kind of thing, correct?
I'm not aware of any severe traumatic head injury.
When we talked about interrogating the defendant for details, that was a word that you had used, right?
I'm not sure that I understand your question. Have I ever used that word? Yes.
In the deposition you used, I did not interrogate him about the details regarding the clarity issues with the Bible and the attorney.
I don't doubt that I said that. That's correct.
So I just didn't want the jury to get the impression that I used the word interrogate because you went to great lengths to say why you wouldn't do that, but you used the word, correct?
Sustained.
You said the defendant spoke about religious ideas after the crime.
I'm sorry.
You said the defendant spoke about religious ideas after the crime?
Yes.
But again, never indicated about the malevolent force, the Ice Age, or anything like that to the officers he came in contact with, correct?
I don't recall that he mentioned the Ice Age to those officers. I do believe his reference to these religious ideas was related to his fear of malevolent forces and his belief that God and great powers of a religious nature were in conflict and fighting, and I believe that he was in fact thinking of and experiencing the feeling that there were malevolent forces at work. I don't recall that anywhere he used the word malevolent.
That was the word you created?
I'm responding to your question.
But he didn't tell any officers any of that.
Didn't tell the
The
officers.
fear that he had, the forces coming after him.
Please let him finish.
I'm sorry, Judge.
No, he did not explain himself. He didn't tell the officers, well, I threw her over the bridge to save her and make her safe. He didn't give any logical explanation for what he did. And in fact, it would be very suspect had he done that.
And you indicated that it would not be unusual for a person to have different details regarding a recollection of a past event.
Yes.
And in psychotic people, even the core story stays the same, you said, correct?
No, I said in most people, the core story stays the same. In psychotic people, there's a lot more difference, but often the core story stays the same.
Anything further from this witness?
No, you're on.
Okay. Questions? questions? And if you're better reading, you can be here. Question from 1179. Does John have multiple personality disorder?
No.
Same answer to your question, 1179?
Yes.
This is also 1179. Can a person who suffers from Mr. Jonchuck's psychotic condition still kill his daughter without experiencing an episode at the exact time of the offense? Do you want to read it?
Yes. Thank you, Your Honor. I think I understand the question. It wasn't entirely clear to me at first. And it's a very reasonable question. I don't think this is a question that modern medicine can yet answer. I don't know.
Okay, 1179?
I just want to, can I said,
Yeah, go ahead.
clarify? Because you stated that you can be sane, you can do something sane, in the next minute you can do something psychotic, correct?
I don't think I said that.
Okay, we need to
Maybe.
write it down. Write it down, okay?
Okay.
There's danger in you turning into a lawyer.
No, I was just explaining why I was
Yeah, I know,
asking.
but explain it in writing, okay? Go ahead. I think
Your Honor, I could-
Hold on, you don't think you said that, correct?
Maybe I stated it.
Not in those exact words. So-
Okay, so his response is he didn't say that. in those
Okay, that's
exact-
okay. That's fine.
Okay,
So I can just ask another, a question pertaining to my question.
okay.
Okay, so. One second. Can I come back? Can you answer the other questions and I'll come back to it?
Sure, but then you won't, if you're thinking about that, then you won't hear the answers to these. I was already going to do that, but that's why I didn't.
That's okay, I'll listen to those.
Thank you.
I can-
Okay. From Juror 1193, possession, exorcism, religious belief, or delusion.
I understand that to mean, what is that? Is it,
That's my understanding. 1193, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, and earlier in your testimony, you said, you brought up the part about religious beliefs versus, I'm just asking for clarification in your field.
yes. It's very important in my field and in my professional work to respect that very intense, strong religious beliefs can look to some professionals like a false belief, like a delusion. But there are very important distinguishing features, and in this case, I am very confident that these ideas about God and the Swedish Bible and the knocking and its meaning are symptoms of mental illness. They're not manifestations of simply strongly held religious beliefs.
Does that answer your question? 1193?
Yes.
Thank you. Do any of the drugs John reported using in parents pills cause hallucinations that might also create flashback hallucinations? You want to look at it?
Yes, I think I understand, but might as well. Thank you, Your Honor. The way I understand this is that flashback hallucinations mean hallucinations that occur well after the drug is out of the person's system.
Okay.
Do I understand that correctly?
Just-
Okay, sorry.
That's
Well,
all right.
that's how I understand it.
Okay.
And the answer to that in this instance would be no. These are not drugs that have any reasonable medical possibility of causing flashback hallucinations or hallucinations that occur significantly after the drug use.
Okay. Does that answer your question, 2247?
Pretty much, yes.
Well, do you have another one?
If there were pills of an unknown nature, as indicated in your statement, would that then be a possibility?
I believe it's extremely unlikely, in part because hallucinations that occur after the intoxication phase, or flashback hallucinations, if you will, very consistently have a different quality. They're very limited. They tend to be focused on one sensation and not a variety of sensations, and they're not associated with these other elements of brain and mental dysfunction.
Does that answer your question? Okay. Well, where evaluations, depositions reviewed from family members taken shortly after the incident when emotions are high and stress could impact ability to provide accurate information. Question, do you want to?
Yes. I believe that it is correct that intense emotions and immediate stress can affect the way people remember and recall information. All of my experience, training, and reading of the literature on the reliability of people's report of instances, whether emotional instances or other instances, is strongly in favor of the conclusion that what you report closer to the incident, and I'm not talking about 3 minutes, but 3 hours or 3 days or even 3 months, is more reliable than what you remember a year later or several months later.
That answer that question? Let me see the question. You still got the one from Mr. Murray. Okay, so thank you. 2247, does that answer that question?
What I'm trying to find out, I understand that, but were those depositions by family members predominantly closer to the time of the incident or later on as to the time when you became involved in it?
Many of them were later on. The police reports were very close to the time of the incident. Many of the depositions were later on. So they have benefit, positive and negative.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Mr. Miranda?
So the other testimony said that your disorder isn't really 24/7. You can still function as a normal human being suffering from how many disorders you have, correct?
So
Yes or no?
Because there was other testimonies that stated made that same statement. You could drive a car, you can still suffer from.
I would say in general a person could. My testimony in this case is I believe his condition was so severe at and around the time of the offense that he couldn't.
Okay, so like with a soldier, he can go and kill somebody, but he's not psychotic.
Okay, we need to, that's a little too far. Does anyone want that question answered?
Well, I was going to refer
Whoa. Lawyers, do you want that question answered?
Perhaps if we could put it in writing and.
Yeah, can you write it down? Thank you. It's a new thing. It's a good thing.
I'm on board.
Take your time, Mr. Miranda. We're not in a rush. We all know that.
We're still referencing this question, or is it?
Okay.
I think that's the one that we're still working on.
Does anyone have that? kill someone in a sane mind, but it's not my disorder that causes me to actually do it. Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. Do you want it or?
Yeah. Yes.
Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions of Dr. Mayer? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. Stand by. Oh, yeah, you follow-up questions? You got it?
Yes.
Okay,
Thank you.
sorry. Oops, there's another question. Oh. We'll be taking a break after this.
I want to go back and clarify something based on something we just heard. Insanity. Is it like a two-step process to go through? In other words, first you determine if the person has a mental illness, a mental disease or defect.
That's correct.
And can a person's mental disease or defect fluctuate over time, over the course of a person's life?
Yes.
When we're talking about your opinion with regards to insanity, are you giving your opinion as to what, well, number one, is it your opinion that John suffered from a mental disease or defect at the time of the offense?
Yes, he suffered from a mental disease and defect, and he was symptomatic of that. That is, it wasn't just in the background, it was active.
And secondly, I want to say they're separate and apart because they're connected, but at the time of the offense in this case, on the night that Phoebe died, at that time, is it your opinion that John understood the nature and consequences of his actions?
No, not in the period of time that he anticipated or carried out those actions.
And did he understand the wrongfulness of his actions at the time?
We're going beyond the scope of the question about the juror.
Did he understand the wrongfulness of his actions at the time of the offense?
Not in any way during any period of time that he anticipated or carried out those actions.
May I see the last question?
Pardon me?
May I approach the podium? Is making a determination that a person is mentally ill, for example, in your clinical practice, that they need treatment, is that different than making a determination, rendering an opinion on insanity?
Ask and answer, Judge.
Overruled.
Yes.
How so?
In a clinical practice, the question is a person suffering from a mental illness, a brain illness, a psychological defect, that in that category? And then the next question is, what do they want? What are their priorities? What are the treatment options that are consistent with what they want? In an insanity evaluation, the question is, do they have a mental disease or defect, brain illness, etc.? And then the next question is, how is that related to their understanding of a particular behavior or action? So in that respect, they start in the same place, is the person mentally ill, but they go in very different directions.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Any follow-up from the state?
I have a question.
Oh, okay. Sorry. No, don't be sorry. You're supposed to be doing that. That's a good sign. His psychotic episode began several days prior to the incident. When did it end? You want it?
That's right. At least several days later, part of the difficulty here is, and I'm responsible for this, I have said that there's a baseline level of psychosis and then there's an episode on top of that. So exactly what does episode mean? The very intense, behaviorally relevant part of it is what I'm talking about. And after this occurs, he's locked up, he's in an abnormal situation. It's very hard to tell when the episode ended. I think he is better now. I don't think he's in that episode now. I think his treatment in the state hospital has been a part of that. I didn't see him, and I don't have good information to say that it ended 3 days later or 3 months later. What I would say very confidently is he was still under the influence of that episode in a direct and meaningful way for several days.
1203, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Any follow-up questions? Anybody else have a question? Dr. Mayer on standby?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Thank you for testifying, Dr. Mayer. Stand by.
Thank you for all the questions.
Thank them. All right, we're going to take a break. We'll take one until 3:15. That gives you 20 minutes. Thank you.
Jury's out of the hearing of the court, Your Honor. All rise. The court will be recessed till 3:15.
Sure.
Yeah.